Europe found this kingdom too advanced, so they called it a myth. You've heard of Atlantis, haven't you? That magical city swallowed by the sea, built by some forgotten genius race that somehow vanished, leaving only legend. But what if I told you that wasn't the only place the world once called too perfect to be real? What if there was a kingdom, real, thriving, brilliant, that Europe stumbled upon, blinked in disbelief, and then tried to vanish by calling it a fairy tale? Not because it was magical, but because it was too advanced, too rich, too black, too proud, and its very existence threatened everything the European Empire wanted the world to believe about who was civilized and who was not. So they erased it. No ruins on your Google Maps, no lectures in your school, no textbook mentions, only whispers. And if you dig too deep, those whispers get dangerous. This kingdom wasn't hiding. It was dazzling, out in the open, full of stone walls that stretched for miles, towers built without mortar standing longer than any European castle, with roads and markets that made travelers think they'd stepped into something impossibly futuristic. It didn't fit the narrative, so it was labeled impossible. Let me take you back, not just in time, but into a world where Africa wasn't the dark continent, but the shining center of power, where kingdoms thrived not in spite of being African, but because they were, where one kingdom in particular stood so bold, so strong, that when Europeans laid eyes on it, they panicked. Because it didn't fit the script. This wasn't a tribe. This wasn't mud huts. This wasn't chaos. It was order, gold, trade, architecture, culture, and most terrifying of all, independence. The place was called Great Zimbabwe. But you won't find it on the list of ancient wonders, because after it was discovered, it was quickly buried, not physically, but ideologically. The Portuguese were the first to hear rumors in the 1500s. They'd been crawling up and down the African coast like parasites, sniffing out spices, gold, and anything they could stick a flag into. Locals told them of a city inland made of stone. Grand stone. The kind that stretched into the sky and circled entire communities. But Europeans didn't want to believe it. Africa wasn't supposed to have cities. It was supposed to be wild, empty, waiting for discovery. So they ignored the stories, called them legends. Years later, when German explorer Karl Mauch stumbled upon the ruins in 1871, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Walls of granite blocks, stacked without any mortar, seamlessly fitted together like ancient puzzle work. Towers rising in perfect geometry. A complex of temples, trading enclosures, and ceremonial spaces all meticulously crafted. Mauch stood in silence, then spoke the most colonial sentence of all time. This couldn't have been built by Africans. It must be a replica of the Queen of Sheba's palace. He said he smelled incense in the walls, that it had to be biblical, even Israeli or Arab. Anything but African. Because if it was African, it would break the world they were trying to build, where whiteness meant genius and blackness meant barbarity. But let's rewind further. Great Zimbabwe was thriving from the 11th century to the 15th. That's hundreds of years of power. It wasn't a single city. It was a capital, surrounded by satellite settlements, a network of kings and artisans and traders who dealt in gold, ivory, iron, and luxury goods. They were connected to the Swahili coast, to China, to India, to Arabia. Persian bowls and Chinese porcelain were dug out of the soil there. Coins from as far as Kilwa. They weren't isolated. They were plugged into a global economy, and they weren't just trading goods. They were trading ideas, mathematics, astrology, metallurgy, urban planning. Their walls weren't just walls, they were calculated alignments of symbolism and power. The conical tower wasn't just a sculpture, it was an architectural flex of religious significance. But none of that made it into your high school history class. Instead, they taught you Egypt, Rome, Greece, always north of Africa, never south. Always whitewashed, never sub-Saharan. Great Zimbabwe was a cultural capital, but to Europeans that couldn't be. Because how do you justify colonizing a people who were running empires when your ancestors were still rubbing sticks together? So they buried it. And when I say they, I mean the scholars, the museums, the textbooks, and the governments who wrote the rules. In the late 1800s, Cecil Rhodes, the infamous colonizer whose name still stains universities, ordered excavations of Great Zimbabwe, but only to prove Africans didn't build it. His archaeologist, Richard Hall, literally wrote that his mission was to remove the filth and decadence of the Kafir occupation, and he destroyed priceless archaeological layers to support his racist theory. Let that sink in. They didn't just lie. They physically ruined the evidence that contradicted their lie. They vandalized history to protect a narrative. Imagine that. A civilization buried under both rubble and racism. But you can't hide brilliance forever. The ruins still stood, daring anyone to question the lie. Local historians, African scholars, and global archaeologists started piecing together the real story. Not only was Great Zimbabwe built by Africans, it was the pinnacle of Bantu civilization, specifically the Shona people. The labor, the science, the art, all local, all brilliant. And still, textbooks hesitated. Museums played dumb. Politicians downplayed it. Even today, some Western institutions still label it controversial. Controversial to say that Africans built an African kingdom in Africa. Why? Because truth is dangerous. If the world sees Africa not as a charity case, but as a cradle of civilization, the entire global hierarchy starts to tremble. Colonization doesn't look like heroism anymore. It looks like theft, like arson, like murder of culture. And so, they'd rather call it a myth. They'd rather say, we just don't know who built it. Even when the fingerprints are clear, even when the oral histories match the stones, even when the descendants are still alive. But the lies weren't just about the past. They were designed to control the future. If you convince people that their ancestors were savages, you make them easier to dominate. If you erase their golden ages, you make their current struggles seem natural. If you hide their kings, you make them forget they were royalty. That's why erasure is the most powerful weapon of empire. It doesn't just kill a culture, it shames the descendants. Great Zimbabwe should be taught beside Athens, beside Rome, beside Machu Picchu and Babylon. But instead, it's sidelined, whispered about, or worse, mocked. The only reason the world even knows the name Zimbabwe is because the modern country reclaimed it from colonial Rhodesia. Even then, it was a battle. The ruins were turned into a nationalist symbol, but still faced sabotage from those who preferred the old lie. You see, this story isn't over, because it was never about ruins. It was about power, who gets remembered, who gets erased, who writes the history, and who lives with its consequences. So the next time someone tells you Africa had no history before colonization, tell them this: Africa didn't lose its history. It was stolen, and then burned, and then blamed for being ashes. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a myth. It was a miracle of its time, a city of stone that didn't crumble, only the truth did. And now we pick up the pieces one by one and tell the world what they tried to forget. So what happens when a lie gets so big it becomes the foundation of empires? What happens when a truth is so powerful it threatens the entire machinery of control? Europe didn't just stumble on Great Zimbabwe and panic. It realized, in one horrifying moment, that the entire blueprint of its colonial fantasy was collapsing. Because if Africans had built cities, governed themselves, traded globally, and lived in order, then the whole justification for invasion, the civilizing mission, was rotten. So instead of admitting the truth, they did what every terrified empire does. They rewrote the story. They erased. They silenced. And then they pointed at the silence and said, "See? Nothing was here." That's not just history. That's gaslighting on a civilizational scale. And yet the stone stood. That's what made Great Zimbabwe so dangerous. It refused to vanish. Its walls didn't crumble. Its towers still curved like poetry. Its existence mocked every lie in every European museum. Imagine trying to convince the world that Africans were incapable of architecture while standing in front of 900-year-old granite walls built with zero mortar and perfect precision. You had to deny it. You had to invent stories. So they did, from Sheba to Phoenicians to wandering Israelites. Anything but Africans. Because the real architects didn't just build a city, they built proof. Proof that Africa didn't need saving. Proof that the narrative was a scam. Proof that black civilization didn't wait for permission to rise. But this wasn't just about one kingdom. It was about all of them. Great Zimbabwe was the tip of a submerged empire, like the top of an iceberg, the part you can't hide. Beneath it were the histories of Mapungubwe, of Kilwa, of Axum, of Nok, of Carthage before it was Romanized and bleached. Kingdoms that traded ivory and iron and gold before Europe even had plumbing. Cultures that mapped the stars, wrote in script, calculated harvest cycles, and governed through dynastic systems that rivaled anything in France or Spain. But Europe needed Africa to be backward so it could justify bleeding it dry. So it tore out the pages and burned the libraries. And for a time it worked. But you're here now, aren't you? You're listening. That means the silence is cracking. That means the ghosts are waking up. Because history has a pulse. And no matter how many lies you pile on top, the truth will claw its way through the rubble. Just like those ruins did. Just like those walls did. Just like you are doing right now. And if you're the kind of person who knows this story deserves to be heard, the kind of person who's tired of the lies they fed you in school, then you already know what I'm about to say. You see, they might have buried Great Zimbabwe, but they can't bury us. Not anymore. That's why I'm telling this story. That's why you're listening. And that's why you need to subscribe, drop a comment, and ring the bell. Because over here on Uncle Luke Tells, we don't just do history. We resurrect it. We dig up what they buried. We say the names they erased. So go ahead, tap the button. Be the one who passes this story on. Now back to the silence, because the silence is louder than you think. In modern-day Zimbabwe, school kids used to be taught about their stone-built ancestors, but not anymore. Political infighting, global shame, and colonial hangovers pushed the truth back into the shadows. In British museums, looted artifacts from Great Zimbabwe are mislabeled, downplayed, or stored in basements. Not because they're unimportant, but because they're inconvenient. Inconvenient to the narrative that Europe lifted Africa out of the mud. Inconvenient to the image of white saviors. Inconvenient to a global system still built on extraction, exploitation, and forgetting. But forgetting isn't the same as erasing, because the stones remember. The oral stories remember. The descendants remember. And they are starting to speak louder. In the 1980s, Zimbabwean scholars launched new digs and found more than just walls. They found tools, sculptures, trading coins, imported ceramics, and even royal grave sites. Every artifact screamed the same thing. We were never primitive. We were pioneers. And yet, even with proof laid bare, the West dragged its feet. Because if they admit this one truth, they'll have to admit the others. That the Congo was an empire before it was a colony. That Ethiopia crushed European invaders at Adwa. That Mansa Musa of Mali had more wealth than any European king, and shared it in gold that shook economies. That Timbuktu had libraries when most of Europe couldn't read. That the entire map of power was drawn in lies. And don't think this only lives in the past. These lies still shape our present. They're why African art still gets called tribal instead of classical. Why African architecture is ignored in global design awards. Why African history gets squeezed into a paragraph while Europe gets entire volumes. It's not ignorance, it's strategy. Because history isn't neutral, it's a battlefield. And the weapon isn't the gun, it's the pen. That's why when Great Zimbabwe was found, it wasn't celebrated, it was criminalized. Rhodes and his successors tried to reduce it to rubble. They covered up indigenous evidence. They censored African scholars. They crafted entire pseudo-academic papers just to say this couldn't have been made by them. That's the level of fear one kingdom sparked. 1. Imagine if the whole truth got out. And now think about this. What if Great Zimbabwe was just the beginning? What if there are still ruins waiting in jungles, deserts, caves, just waiting to be unburied? What if entire histories still live in folk songs, carvings, coded symbols passed down by families who never forgot? What if Africa isn't the continent of poverty they show on charity ads, but a continent of memory that's been locked away behind shame and propaganda? That's the real myth. The myth is that Africa had no myths, that it was blank until Europe wrote on it, that it was dark until Europe lit it up, that it was savage until Europe arrived to save it. But none of that was true. What was true was this: Africa had its own stars, its own cities, its own gods and governance and glory. And that scared the world too much to allow it to be real. So they said it was fake. They said it was too perfect, too advanced, so they called it a myth. So while they sold their lie to the world, we kept our truth in songs, in stories whispered around firelight, in names etched into stone long before Europe learned to etch anything. While they printed textbooks soaked in imperial pride, we passed history through rhythm and pattern, cloth and drum, braided into the hair of daughters and folded into the silence of mourning mothers who remembered when their homes were cities and their cities were sacred. They mocked our memory as myth, but what they feared most was that the memory would outlive them. And it has. Because a myth fades, but a kingdom remembered, even in fragments, even in exile, is a kingdom waiting to return, and it has begun. Because this isn't just a story. This is a crack in the wall they built, and once there's a crack, the light gets in. That's why every statue they raised on stolen land starts to shake when we speak these names out loud. That's why Great Zimbabwe is dangerous. Not because of its past, but because of its potential. Because if that place was real, if that kingdom stood without Europe, then the whole story changes. Then maybe Europe wasn't the light of the world. Maybe it was just the loudest thief in the room. And maybe, just maybe, the future doesn't need to be written in Latin and French and English. Maybe it can be written in Shona, in Yoruba, in Amharic, in Wolof, in Zulu, in Kikuyu, in languages they tried to beat out of us, erase from our tongues, burn out of our schools. But the languages survived, and now they're waking up. Go look at who's building Africa's tech scene now, who's rewriting history books, who's archiving oral stories, digitizing them, making apps that teach pre-colonial philosophy. It's not outsiders, it's not saviors. It's the children of the people who once stood inside those stone walls, who were told their history didn't matter, and who are now writing it back into existence. The archaeologists with braids, the professors with ancestral tattoos, the engineers building tools to map ancient cities with drones, satellites, and soul. This isn't nostalgia. This is resurrection. Because for centuries, we were told we were the ruins, that the stone walls were the last breath, but they were never the ending. They were the pause, and we're the sentence that comes next. They feared this moment, the moment we stop asking permission to speak, the moment we stop citing their sources and start citing our grandmothers, the moment we stop wondering what they took and start taking back what's ours, not just physically, but narratively, spiritually, historically, emotionally. This is the moment they lose the monopoly on memory. Because it's not just about kings and queens, it's about the power to remember without apology. And that power scares them. That's why they still resist it. Why the moment an African scholar publishes truth, some white critic calls it revisionist. Why every attempt to repatriate stolen African artifacts turns into a bureaucratic war. Why even now, ruins like Great Zimbabwe are underfunded, underprotected, underacknowledged, because acknowledging means confronting, and confronting means confessing, and confession is dangerous for people who built wealth on denial. But we don't need their confession. We have the stones, we have the stories, we have the memory. And memory, once awakened, is unstoppable. It leaks into architecture, into music, into literature, into the bones of the land. Memory turns into fire, and that fire turns into action. It's already happening. Universities across Africa are reshaping their curriculums. Pan-African archives are popping up like resistance gardens. Youth movements are decolonizing minds faster than any colonizer can react, and Great Zimbabwe stands like a signal tower, a reminder that we've done it before, that we built before they broke, that we ruled before they robbed. So what now? Now we stop whispering. We stop letting them gatekeep our past. We make documentaries that don't beg for Western validation. We create content that shouts the truth and doesn't flinch. We build platforms that say what the textbooks refuse. We resurrect queens they buried, empires they denied, and scientists they stole credit from. We challenge the maps, the museums, the institutions. We reclaim. We rebel. We remember, not like victims, but like survivors who are done surviving and ready to build again. Because Great Zimbabwe wasn't just built with stone. It was built with belief. Belief that we were enough. Belief that our systems, our gods, our aesthetics, our genius was valid. It was built with mathematics passed down through generations, with cultural symbols that turned walls into spiritual diagrams. It was designed with cosmology in mind, aligned with stars, with sun cycles, with philosophy encoded in architecture. That's not just brilliance, that's divinity. And they knew it. That's why they tried to erase it, not just because it existed, but because it dared to exist without them. And that's what we're doing now, reclaiming the right to exist without them, not as shadows in their narrative, not as background characters in their global drama, but as the authors of our own epic. And this story, the one they called a myth, is chapter 1. So here's how we end this, even though the story never ends. We go back to the beginning, not theirs, ours. We point to the stone and say, that was us. We point to the silence and say, that was them. We carry the fire forward. We name the kings they denied. We remember the roads they pretended weren't there. We honor the mothers who raised scholars, the warriors who built without permission, the thinkers who mapped the universe from the southern hemisphere. We stop asking if it matters. It does. We stop wondering if we're allowed. We are. We stop treating the truth like a guest in their house. Because this house, this story, this legacy is ours. Great Zimbabwe wasn't lost. It was hidden. And now it's found.